We're excited to offer a variety of Bible studies this fall at CBF. Our co-ed studies include Grace in Eclipse, The Art of Parenting, Crown Biblical Financial Study, the Epistle of James, and Things to Know So You Can Grow. All the details about these and other classes and the links to register can be found on our website. We also have studies that are specific to men and women. There is Life with God, Discerning the Voice of God, and the Men's Wednesday Night Bible Study. And again, all the details about these great studies and classes can be found on our website as well as the links to register. Our Connection dinners are continuing through the summer and everyone is invited. Join us for a relaxed dinner with other CBF families. There is absolutely no commitment for coming, but we ask for you to RSVP at least 5 days in advance. Visit our website for more information or to RSVP, and you can direct any questions to Tammy Hogan. Good morning. We are so excited for you to join us for our online service here at Coppell Bible Fellowship. But we would love to see you in person at one of our services on Sunday morning at 9 and 10:45 a.m. Now let's go before the Lord in worship.
Daily, daily I surrender. Grace for today is all that I need. Surprised by your mercy, it's new every morning. Awaken my soul to sing. Awaken my soul to sing. I will trust where you lead. I will trust when I can't see. Morning by morning, great is your faithfulness to me. Breath by breath, overtaken by one step at a time when I'm overwhelmed. Strength for today and bright hope for tomorrow. Awaken my soul to sing. Awaken my soul to sing. I will trust. Great is your faithfulness to me. I will trust with all my heart. You are good, you always are. Morning by morning, great is your faithfulness to me. Oh, fear, be reminded. My future is secure. My Father, He has spoken, and He keeps His every word. All fear, be reminded, my future is secure. For my Father, He has spoken, and He keeps His trust where you lead. I will trust when I can't see. Morning by morning, great is your faithfulness to me. I will trust where you lead. I will trust when I can't see. Morning by morning, great is your faithfulness to me. I will trust with all my heart.
Amen. Y'all can grab a seat. Man, give it up for that worship band. That is awesome. I love that last song. That was great. Welcome to CBF this morning. So great to see y'all here. If this is your first time, just want to welcome you again. My name is Brian. I'm the youth pastor here, but I get to bring the message today. So we're going to open up God's Word together. Really excited to get into that. Maybe you've heard this quote before. It's kind of a well-known quote, but it goes something like this. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Maybe you've heard that quote before. We don't really know who exactly said it, but it's a really powerful statement. And it raises this issue of passivity. Passivity is something that every one of us can struggle with. We can fall into that very easily. Passivity is the idea of, we're slow to take initiative, we're slow to take action. If we allow problems to continue without being addressed, we're being passive. Now, passivity is always easier in the moment, in the short term. Maybe you're at work and you see someone being treated misfairly, or at school you see someone getting picked on. It's easier in the moment maybe to just pass the buck, say, someone else is going to handle that. I don't want to get my hands dirty and get, into that mess. Maybe there's an issue between you and your spouse, or between you and a close friend. It might be easier for the short term to just kind of act like everything's fine, right? Let's not address this, because after all, sometimes addressing conflict, addressing disagreement can be tough, right? Any number of things, can be a situation where we can be passive instead of active. But God calls us as believers, as His people, to not be passive in our faith, but to be active in our faith, to be quick to hear and obey the Lord. Passivity is not a positive quality in the Christian life. God calls us to be people of action. Now, there's any number of reasons why we may choose to live passively rather than actively in our faith. Maybe it's fear. We're afraid to act on our faith for some reason. Maybe it's just a simple struggle with laziness. Maybe we just don't really feel like doing it. Maybe we've just become comfortable and content with the way things are, and so addressing some problem or issue might seem a little tough, something we don't want to do. Whatever the reason is, though, God calls us to be people who aren't afraid and aren't slow to take action, to do the right thing, and to act on our faith. We're going to see this issue come up in our story today that we're going to look at. We've been looking over the last several weeks through Hebrews 11 at each one of these characters that the author mentions in this chapter and their backstory and everything. The whole theme of Hebrews 11 is how these Old Testament believers did amazing things for the Lord through their faith. Today we're going to meet a character that maybe some of y'all haven't heard of before. He really only pops up in these couple chapters in the book of Judges we're going to look at. But in Hebrews, towards the end of Hebrews, in verse 32, he says, "What more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and the prophets." So in other words, he says, man, I could keep going. I could go through all these stories and more, but I'm just going to name these guys and then move on. But last week we looked at this story of Gideon, and today we're going to look at the story of a man named Barak. And his story is in Judges chapter 4. You can turn there. But we're going to see in this story of Barak, we're going to see how faith can be the thing. It can be the catalyst that helps us move out of passivity into taking action for the Lord. So turn to Judges 4. We're going to look at this together. I'm going to start in verse 1. It says this, "When Ehud was dead, the children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hatzor. And the commander of his army was Sisera, who dwelt in Harosheth Hagoyim. And the children of Israel cried out to the Lord, for Jabin had 900 chariots of iron, and for 20 years he had harshly oppressed the children of Israel." So we talked about this last week a little bit, but just a little background of the book of Judges. Judges has this repeated cycle that we see the nation of Israel go through. God chose the Israelites to be His chosen people on earth. It wasn't because He liked them better than everybody else. It was because He chose them to be a light to the nations. And He intended that Israel would take over the promised land and that they would live in this promised land obeying God's law, and that they would reflect and show the rest of the nations around them what life under God's rule was supposed to look like. That was their intent. That was what God wanted them to do. But Israel, we see, is constantly rebelling against God. Throughout the book of Judges, we see this cycle, and it goes like this. Israel rebels against God. They start worshiping false gods. They disobey God's law. So God brings a foreign nation against them to oppress them and to subjugate them. Then Israel cries out to the Lord for help, and God responds by sending someone to deliver them. But when that deliverer has passed away and is gone, the nation inevitably slips back into their idolatry, back into their rebellion, and the cycle starts all over again. So at the start of chapter 4, we're seeing another one of these cycles begin. He says the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. That would have included idolatry. That would have included all sorts of disobedience to God's law. So God brings this king, he names him Jabin, the king of Canaan. So this isn't actually some king invading the land. This is a king that is living in the land, and he allows this king to subjugate and oppress the people of Israel for 20 years, he says. He oppresses him. Now look at how he describes Jabin. He describes him as reigning in Hatzor. That was a really powerful city in northern Galilee at the time. And he says Jabin had 900 chariots of iron. So he's painting this picture. Jabin is this really powerful dude. He's this formidable king. You don't want to mess with him, right? He's got a really powerful army behind him, and he's using his power to oppress the people of Israel for 20 years. So Israel cries out to the Lord, and we're going to see how the Lord responds. But before we move on, I want us to notice one more thing. Notice how he starts out. He says, this all happened when Ehud was dead. Now, we haven't looked at the story of Ehud, but if we were to go back to chapter 3, we would see this man's story. This man was another deliverer of Israel, and God used Ehud to deliver the people of Israel from the Moabites. Now, Ehud was this courageous, brave warrior. He infiltrated, behind enemy lines. He kills the king of Moab single-handedly. He escapes, runs and rallies the troops, and then he says, follow me, the Lord's given us the victory, and they all follow Ehud into battle, and they get this amazing victory. So Ehud is he's the man, right? Like he is this triumphant, strong, powerful, courageous leader of Israel. And so when the author says Ehud is dead, it creates this anticipation. Who's going to be the next Ehud? Who's going to be the guy that's this courageous leader, that takes Ehud's place? But what we're going to see is the next deliverer of Israel doesn't quite live up to the standard of Ehud. Verse 4, now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. And she would sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the mountains of Ephraim. And the children of Israel came up to her for judgment. So the first character we meet is a woman named Deborah. And this kind of catches us off guard, right? Throughout the book of Judges, every deliverer of Israel is a man. And so we expect to meet who's the next Ehud, right? Who's the next tough guy that's going to step in there? First person we meet is a woman named Deborah. Now the author goes out of his way to really emphasize and highlight the fact that Deborah is a woman. He could have just said Deborah, right? We know Deborah's a woman's name. He could have just said that and stopped. But in the Hebrew, it literally reads, now Deborah, a woman, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, she was judging Israel at that time. So in multiple ways, he highlights the fact that she's a woman. Now, the reason he does that is to raise an issue in the nation of Israel at this time. Because Deborah is carrying out the role of judge. Now, that was a legal role. She would have heard legal disputes and kind of settled legal disputes for people. So, for example, widows and orphans at that time were a very vulnerable people group. They could be easily exploited, easily taken advantage of. So you can imagine a situation like, someone steals a widow's property or land, and the widow takes her case to the local judge. And she says, hey, this is what was done to me. And that judge was responsible to make that right, to administer justice for that person, to make sure this widow was being treated fairly and justly. So that was the role of a judge. Now, the reason it's significant that Deborah is a woman doing this role is because back in Exodus 18, when God initially set this whole thing up of judges in the land, it was supposed to be men. And it was appoint men to act as judges in the land. Now, that has nothing to do with capability or anything like that. Clearly, Deborah was very capable, and clearly God put her in that role. So it has nothing to do with that. We're going to talk about this more later at the end of the sermon. But for now, what I want us to see is that the author is emphasizing Look at Deborah, this woman, doing this role, and it raises this question, where are the male leaders in the country? Where are the strong, able men, godly men who are willing and able to take on this role of judge? Either there's no godly men around to do it, or they're not willing to step into that role of leadership for the people. And so he's raising this problem of Israel at this time was lacking in male leaders, and that was a problem. So Deborah is doing this, she's acting as judge in this place. And then it says in verse 6, then she sent and called for Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, has not the Lord God of Israel commanded, go and deploy troops at Mount Tabor. Take with you 10,000 men of the sons of Naphtali and of the sons of Zebulun. And against you I will deploy Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his multitude at the river Kishon, and I will deliver him into your hand. So Deborah calls for Barak. Now remember, Deborah is a prophetess, which means that God would reveal messages to her that she was to communicate to the people. So she sends for Barak and communicates a message from Yahweh to Barak and says, hey, Yahweh commands you, get your troops together, go to Mount Tabor. He's going to bring Sisera and his army to you. So that's the command. Now notice, this isn't a suggestion. This is a command. She says, Yahweh has commanded you to do this. Now, notice too the double use of the word deploy. She says, Yahweh has commanded you to go and deploy troops at Mount Tabor. And then a little ways down, Yahweh says, and I will deploy Sisera and his army and his chariots and all his power to this other place. Now, that's significant because on the one hand, Sisera is his own man, right? He's going to make his decisions freely. He's going to act. He's going to move his troops around as he sees fit. But God is reminding Barak, hey, ultimately, I'm the one in charge. On a higher level, God is orchestrating things so that Sisera ends up doing exactly what God wants him to do. And there's a lesson here for us that God, even though we don't always understand it, God is in charge of history. And God is working through the events of history to bring his plan and his purposes to pass. And so God commands Barak, get your troops together. I'm going to bring Sisera and his army to you, and you're going to get the victory over him. Look at how Barak responds. Verse 8. And Barak said to her, if you will go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. Now, I forget, was that a suggestion that God had given Barak? Hey, if you got time for it, can you just get your troops over here real quick? No, it was a command, very clearly. Deborah said, has not Yahweh commanded you to do this? And notice how Barak treats this as this optional thing. Yeah, I'll obey you, but only on my own terms. Only if my conditions are met. How often do we do that same thing? We know what God has told us to do. We know how God has called us to live and commanded us to live. And we say, yeah, I'll do that, but if my conditions aren't met, I won't. I know God says, hey, speak truthfully, don't lie. And I'll tell the truth, but man, if it's going to get me in trouble, then I'll just go ahead and lie. It's just easier, right? I know God says, honor your father and mother, but if they're, really not treating me the way I want them to treat me, then I don't have to do that. How often do we approach God's commands as if they're optional? But the reality is, God's commands are not suggestions. They're not, hey, if you got time for it, you should try this. It's a command. And God is our king. God is our creator. He has the right to do that, right? And so when God gives us a command, we have the responsibility to respond with obedience, not passively, not slowly, but actively, that we would hear what God has to command us and that we would act on that with eagerness, with a ready heart. But Barak approaches this as if it were conditional. But God's commands are not conditional. And so look at how Deborah responds to him. Verse 9, she says, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, there will be no glory for you in the journey you are taking. For the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. So Deborah tells Barak, she says, okay, if you're only going to obey God, if I go with you, then I'll go. But you need to understand there's a consequence for your conditional obedience here. And the consequence is going to be that you don't get the glory for this victory. The glory and the credit for the victory is ultimately going to go to a woman. Now, at this point in the story, the only woman we know is Deborah. And so we think to ourselves, well, it's going to be Deborah. Somehow Deborah's going to come in there and she's going to defeat Sisera and all this. But as we're going to see throughout this story, there's a lot of twists and turns in this story. So it goes on, it says, Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. And Barak called Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh. He went up with 10,000 men under his command. And Deborah went up with him. Now Heber the Kenite of the children of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, had separated himself from the Kenites, and had pitched his tent near the terebinth tree of Zaanaim, which is beside Kadesh. And they reported to Sisera that Barak the son of Abinoam had gone up to Mount Tabor. So Sisera gathered together all his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the people who were with him from Harosheth Hagoyim to the river Kishon. I'm glad I got through that passage. There's a lot of names that are hard to pronounce, so we made it through. So what do we see happening here? I want to note, first of all, that Deborah is the first one to act. So it says, Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. So Barak, we catch this glimpse, Barak is kind of behind in the action. He's slow to act. Barak then gathers his troops together, goes to Mount Tabor. A few verses down, we see that Sisera gets this report from his scouts that Barak has, taken his troops to Mount Tabor. So Sisera gets his army together and goes exactly to the place that God said he would bring him. But notice that in the report that Sisera gets, all we're told is they reported to Sisera that Barak, the son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor. Who's not there in that statement? Deborah. They don't report to Barak, apparently, that Deborah was with Barak doing this. So this is ultimately going to be Sisera's downfall. He thinks that the only threat is going to come from a man. And he doesn't recognize that ultimately there's a woman that he has to fear. Ultimately, the downfall is going to come at the hands of a woman, not the hands of a man. But notice in between the report of Barak getting his army together, Sisera getting his army together, we see this reference to this guy named Heber the Kenite. Now this comes completely out of left field. We're like, who in the world is this and why does he matter to the story? But we're told that this man, Heber the Kenite, was of the family of Moses' father-in-law, Hobab. Kids, if you don't like your name, just be glad it's not that. And back in Exodus, we're told that Moses married a non-Israelite woman, and here we learn that she was a member of the Kenite people. And this man, Heber, belonged to that family line, but he, for some reason, we don't know, separated from the rest of the Kenites and moved up north into the Galilee area. Now, at this point, we don't know why this matters to the story. But it's important, just a tip as you're reading the Bible, it's important to pay attention to details like that. Because authors don't just drop these details in randomly for no reason. Not every detail in Scripture carries the same significance, but every detail is there for a reason. And so the author, just like in movies today, when you watch a movie and it's like they drop this little thing in there, you're like, I don't know why that matters. But later on in the story, you're like, oh, that matters. So authors love to do this too. So far we know, all right, the stage is set for a battle. Barak and his army, Sisera and his army, and then there's this mysterious guy named Heber, and I don't know why he matters, but he's going to come up later on. Verse 14, Then Deborah said to Barak, Up, for this is the day in which the Lord has delivered Sisera into your hand. Has not the Lord gone out before you? So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. And the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army with the edge of the sword before Barak. And Sisera alighted from his chariot and fled away on foot. But Barak pursued the chariots and the army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim, and all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not a man was left. Notice again that Deborah initiates the action here. It's Deborah that comes to Barak and says, Get up and go into battle. And then Barak does it. So again, we're seeing Barak is slow to act. Barak is always behind the action here. Deborah is leading this thing. Barak gets up and goes, and it says the Lord gave them a victory. The Lord routed Sisera's army before him. And again, we see, in a sense, Barak is again behind in the action. It says he goes, gets his troops and everything, but then the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army before Barak. So again, Barak doesn't really do much in this story. I'm sure he did fight. I'm sure he did wield the sword and all that. But at least the way the narrator is telling us, he's presenting Barak as some guy who's kind of always behind in the action. He does the right thing, but he's a little late to do it. So God gives them this victory. But then in verse 16, we see that at some point in the battle, Sisera, the general, gets down from his chariot and he goes running. But Barak chases after the chariots. So again, we're seeing Barak doesn't really see where Sisera is going. He thinks Sisera is escaping, so he chases him, but Sisera is going in the opposite direction. So as the battle ends, we get this idea, this picture that Sisera is getting away, and Barak doesn't realize it. Verse 17, however, Sisera had fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, for there was peace between Jabin king of Hatzor and the house of Heber the Kenite. So now we start to see some dots connected here. This guy Heber comes up again, and now we know why he matters to the story. He's an ally of King Jabin, and we know that Sisera has escaped the battle, and now we see, oh man, Sisera's getting with one of his allies. Maybe he's going to get protected. Maybe he's going to get away. But notice how Heber, we never actually meet Heber. We meet his wife, Jael. Verse 18, and Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me. Do not fear. And when he had turned aside with her into the tent, she covered him with a blanket. Then he said to her, please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty. So she opened a jug of milk, gave him a drink, and covered him. So Jael comes out of her tent, sees Sisera running to her and says, hey, I'll take you in, I'll protect you. She covers him up with a blanket. He asks for a drink, and she gives him milk, which would probably help him sleep, make him even more tired. But we see this picture. It seems like Jael is this welcoming host, right? She tucks him into bed for a nap. She's like, I'm sure you're tired, and cover you up with a blanket. Gives him some milk to drink. And right before Sisera goes off to sleep, look at what he tells this woman. And he said to her, stand at the door of the tent, and if any man comes and inquires of you and says, is there any man here? You shall say, no. Who is Sisera afraid of? What's the gender of the person that he's afraid of? He only fears a man. He thinks that's the only threat to his life. And he knows there's this guy Barak chasing him. So he says, hey, if you stand at the door, keep watch. If you see a man coming, tell him, I'm not here. Tell him to keep going. He never realizes that his biggest threat is going to come at the hands of this woman who seems so nice to him. Now, viewer discretion advised on the next verse, just FYI. Verse 21, then Jael, Heber's wife, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand and went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple. And it went down into the ground, for he was fast asleep and weary. So he died. And I want to say, yeah, you think he died? Yeah. So this is kind of one of those brutal scenes in the Bible, right? But the Bible sometimes doesn't spare details. And this woman, Jael, is a pretty tough cookie here, right? She portrayed herself as this welcoming host. Come on into my tent. I'll tuck you into bed. I'll protect you and everything. And then the moment he's off to sleep, she takes him out. And we start to see, okay, now we see Jael's true colors, right? Her husband is an ally to Jabin, but apparently she's not. And she takes out Israel's enemy. And it's at this point that Barak shows up. Verse 22. And then as Barak pursued Sisera, Jael came out to meet him and said to him, come, I will show you the man whom you seek. And when he went into her tent, there lay Sisera, dead with the peg in his temple. Notice again that Barak is late to the action. He gets there, but he gets there too late to take Sisera out. He gets there just in time for the woman Jael to say, hey, yeah, come here, let me show you the guy you've been looking for. Here he is. I've taken care of him for you. And I got to believe that Barak in that moment remembered Deborah's words, and then he realized, Deborah was right. Because I was slow to obey, because I was hesitant, because I was reluctant to obey God when he said to do it, this is the consequence. That ultimately, I'm not the one that gets the glory for this victory. That glory would go to this non-Israelite woman named Jael. The author summarizes what happens after this in the next couple verses. He says in verse 23, so on that day, God subdued Jabin, king of Canaan, in the presence of the children of Israel. And the hand of the children of Israel grew stronger and stronger against Jabin, king of Canaan, until they had destroyed Jabin, king of Canaan. So we're reminded in these last couple verses that ultimately the victory goes to God. God was behind all the events in this story. God was behind Deborah's message to Barak. God was behind the movement of troops. God was behind orchestrating how Jael was able to get victory over Sisera, all these things. And God would go on to lead the Israelites to victory over Jabin, and they would be delivered from the oppression that they were under. And so it's this reminder that ultimately God is the one who gives us the victory. It's not by our own doing. Now, as we've looked at this story, we've seen the story of Barak and Deborah and all these characters. I think there's a few things that we need to pull out of this story for ourselves today. The first thing I want us to ask is, why is this man Barak in Hebrews 11? As we read this story, I would have thought the author of Hebrews would name Deborah or would name Jael, right? I mean, after all, Deborah seems like a better leader. Jael definitely had more nerve and more, courage than Barak. Barak is slow to the action. He obeys, he does the right thing, but he does it late and hesitantly. So why is Barak mentioned in Hebrews 11 as a man of faith? I think we catch a glimpse of this in the verses that the author of Hebrews gives after mentioning Barak and these other guys. In verse 33 of Hebrews 11, he mentioned Barak, he mentioned Gideon and all these other people, and then he says, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. I want us especially to see that phrase, out of weakness were made strong. We've seen through Barak's story, this man was a man with some weaknesses. This man was hesitant. This man was passive. This man did the right thing, but he was slow to get there. He only wanted to obey God on his own terms. And yet, out of that weakness, through his faith, he was made strong. He was a man of faith in the end. It took faith to rally the troops together and to lead them into battle. Even though Barak was slow to get there, in the end, he did act on his faith. And the author of Hebrews wants you to know, wants me to know, wants us all to know that, hey, even if you're screwed up, even if you're a person with a lot of weaknesses, God can still use you. Your weaknesses don't disqualify you from being used by God. So you might think to yourself, I'm not a good leader. You might think to yourself, I'm not courageous. You might think to yourself, I'm not skilled enough, or whatever it is, or I've done too many bad things. But the reality is, if God can use people like Barak, people like Gideon, people like the ones we're going to see in the upcoming weeks, God can use you too. It all comes down to, are you willing to believe God and then act on it? But I think there's some other things that we need to pull out of this text. Even though God can use us in spite of our weaknesses, doesn't mean it's okay for us to overlook those weaknesses. It doesn't mean we don't still need to address weaknesses in our lives and areas of immaturity in our lives. And passivity is definitely one of those things that we need to address as Christians. God calls us to be people of action, not people who pass the buck and say, I'm going to let somebody else do that. But we can all so easily slip into that passivity, a reluctance to obey God, only wanting to obey Him on our own terms. Let me give you just a simple example of how the idea of passivity can even show up in our own church on a Sunday morning. Now, I don't know about you guys, but sometimes I come to church, us on staff, we feel the same way you guys do sometimes. So it's like, hey, sometimes you just come to church and you're like, I listen to the sermon, I sing the songs, and then at the end of the service, I'm ready to take off, right? Like, I'm hungry, I'm ready to eat some lunch. Sunday is a great nap day, so I'm like, man, I'm going to go take a nap. I just want to relax. You guys ever feel that way? Like, man, I'm ready to go. And so sometimes Kaylee doesn't. Kaylee just wants to be here all the time. And sometimes, I'm just ready. I don't want to linger too long. But let me paint a scenario for you that maybe you can identify with. Maybe you come here on a Sunday morning, you're singing the songs, you're sitting through the service, and you notice a couple rows in front of you someone you don't recognize. Or maybe a couple of people you don't recognize, and you think, oh, these people might be new. And, the service ends, you get up, and you're like, man, I'm ready to take off. I could go talk to those new people, but someone else will do it. And you just take off, go get your lunch, go take your nap, all those things. I've done that before. Absolutely, I've definitely done that before. We probably, if we're honest, we've all done that before, right? But have you ever been that new person? Have you ever been the new person at a church or the new person somewhere and you're going there and it's intimidating, right? You're like, man, there's a ton of people here I don't know. There's a lot of faces I don't recognize. And I hope someone comes and talks to me. I hope someone comes and welcomes me here. But what if everyone does what you did? What if everyone says, someone else is going to do it? Then no one does it, right? And then that person sits through the service, no one talks to them, no one welcomes them. What if that happens a couple weeks? Maybe they don't come back. Maybe they say, I tried. I don't know. I went and no one talked to me. Now, I'm not trying to say we have a big problem with that at CBF. First time I came here, like 4 years ago, several people, Kayla, you were one, like you just beeline to me. You're like, hey, I don't know who you are. Tell me your name. And I felt really welcomed, and that was great. But if we're not careful, we can so easily slip into that, right? We can so easily get comfortable. I know I've got my handful of people that I like to talk to and stuff, and it's so easy then to get too comfortable, and then we overlook those opportunities. That's just one small example of how passivity can ultimately be damaging. When we pass the buck, when we say someone else is going to do it, it can be damaging to a church. Now, I think there's another thing that we can pull out of this text that I especially want the men in the room to hear. So, in the story we saw that the author highlighted the fact that Deborah, a woman, was carrying out the role of judge in Israel. Now, the reason the author highlighted that was to raise this issue of a lack of male leadership in the nation of Israel at that time. God had appointed men to take on that role of judge. It had nothing to do with capability of women. Deborah did a great job. God put her in that role, right? But it doesn't change the fact that men were responsible to do that, and evidently, for whatever reason, they weren't doing it. And I think this problem of lack of male leadership can be a problem that we struggle with today as well. I don't know about you, but our culture likes to throw a lot at men. It likes to emasculate men. It likes to present men. Think about TV shows. How many shows present a dad as a bumbling idiot who never does anything right? How many songs present guys as if all they care about is, sex and sports and beer and football, like all these things, right? Like that's what a man is. And sometimes us men, we believe that, right? And we think that's what I'm supposed to be as a man. But actually, God calls men to be leaders. God calls men to take on responsibility, to set an example for others to follow. We see this right in the very beginning of the Bible. When God created the man and the woman, in Genesis 2, we're told he created the man first. And he gave the man authority to name the animals. He then creates the woman as a helper for Adam so that they both can carry out God's command to rule his creation. Then he gives Adam the authority to name Eve, but then catch this. In Genesis 3, when they sin, who does God come to first? Adam. Now, Eve was the one that sinned first. And yet God comes to Adam and says, Adam, what did you do? And it shows us that in that situation, at least, God held Adam more responsible than he held Eve. They both sinned. It wasn't okay what Eve did either. But God held Adam more responsible. And then Adam's like, you gave her to me, she tempted me. Like he wants to pass the buck, right? He doesn't want to take responsibility. But God came to Adam first because he held Adam more responsible. Now, this difference in responsibility, this difference in levels of authority and things like this that we see at times, not always, but at times in the Bible between men and women, that has nothing to do with one being superior than the other, one being inferior to the other. It's not a better, worse thing at all. At all. In fact, Genesis is explicit that God created the man and the woman equally in his image. We are equally image bearers, equal in dignity, equal in value, equal in worth, all of that. But that doesn't mean that there's not times when God calls men and women to have different roles, different levels of responsibility. And so there are times like in marriage, like in the church with the role of elder, where God places a certain level of responsibility on men that he doesn't place on women. That doesn't mean women can't be leaders. Women make great leaders. And we see awesome women leaders all over the place, right? But in certain areas, God has men take on certain levels of responsibility. We see this same dynamic in God himself. Think about the Trinity. As Christians, we believe in one God that exists in three persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. All three members of the Trinity are equally God, and yet they have different roles. So, for example, God the Son died on the cross, not God the Father, not God the Spirit. God the Father sent the Son into the world, not the Spirit. God the Spirit dwells in believers. The Father and the Son don't dwell in believers. Jesus even said in John 5, I can do nothing on my own authority. Only what the Father authorizes me to do, that I do. So we see different levels of authority where in some mysterious way we don't fully understand, God the Father has more authority than God the Son, and God the Son submits to the authority of God the Father. What that tells us is that authority, different levels of authority and submission can't mean inequality. It can't mean superior or inferior. That's not what it means. It just means different roles at times. And so there are times when God calls men and women to different roles. That doesn't mean, our culture likes to read into that and say, oh, the Bible's misogynistic, the Bible hates women, or something like that. That's not at all what this is communicating. But the reality is God calls men to be leaders. And in certain specific capacities, sometimes he does that. But us as men, if we're honest, sometimes we shy away from that, right? We don't want to take on responsibility. We want to be passive. We want to pass the buck to someone else. We can be slow to act and slow to obey God at times. And so we see situations like God is perfectly capable of raising up a strong woman like Deborah, but that doesn't mean he didn't still call the men in Israel to be leaders. And for us today, he calls us as men to embrace the responsibility in the leadership roles that God has put on us and to set an example for others of what it looks like to follow the Lord. How many families are damaged because men don't lead well in the home? How many churches are damaged because men don't step up and lead in the church? If you're not appointed as an elder here at CBF and you're a man, that doesn't mean you shouldn't still strive for the character of an elder so that you're the type of man that could be an elder if needed. And so that's the idea, is that we as men need to take on that responsibility. We need to be quick and eager to obey. Barak was slow to act. Barak was passive. Barak did the right thing, but he was slow to get there. And we're called to not follow that example, but to be quick and eager to hear what God has to say and to obey it and to set an example for others. But the bottom line is this: whether you're a man or whether you're a woman, God calls us to be people of action. He doesn't call us to put off obeying him. He doesn't call us to say, yeah, I'll obey God, but only on my own terms. He calls us to hear what God has to say and to be eager and ready to do it when God commands us to do it. That's what living by faith is supposed to look like. And so my challenge to all of us today, myself included, is what is God calling you to do? Where in your life do you need to be active and take the initiative to obey God, to address issues in your life or in your family or in whatever it is? Because we're called to do that today. Don't put that off until tomorrow. Don't put that off until next week or next month. We're called to be people who hear what God has to say and do it by faith. That's what the life of faith is supposed to look like.
Spirit of the living God, Spirit of the living God, we only want to hear your voice. We're hanging on every word. Spirit of the living God, Spirit of the living God, we want to know you more and more. We're hanging on every word. Come and speak to us, O Lord. Spirit of the living God, Spirit of the living God, we only want to hear your voice. We're hanging on every word. Spirit of the living God, Spirit of the living God, we want to know you more and more. We're hanging on every word. 'Cause when you speak, when you move, when you do what only you can do, it changes us, it changes what we see and what we seek. When you come in the room, when you do what only you can do, it changes us, it changes Spirit of the living God, Spirit of the living God, we're leaning into all you are. Everything else can wait. Spirit of the living God, Spirit of the living God, come now and breathe upon our hearts. Come now and have your way. 'Cause when you speak, when you move, when you do what only you can do, it changes us, it changes what we see and what we seek. When you come in the room, when you do what only you can do, it changes us, it changes what we see and what we seek. You're changing everything. When you move all our fears. When you move us to tears. When you move all our fears. When you move us to tears. When you fall, we fall on our knees. When you fall, we fall at your feet. Oh, when you fall, we fall on our knees. Oh, when you fall, we fall at your feet. 'Cause when you speak, when you move, when you do what only you can do, it changes us, it changes what we see and what we seek. When you come in the room, when you do what only you can do, it changes us, it changes what we see and what we see. You're changing everything. Spirit of the living God, Spirit of the living God, we only want to hear your voice. We're hanging on every word.
Well, I hope you're encouraged this morning by the word and our worship, and I hope we get to see you before too long here in person at one of our services, 9 or 10:45. Have a fantastic week.